This next segment is brought to you by Blue Cross and Blue Shield's National Labor Office. You know, Blue Cross and Blue Shield companies formed out of a need to provide affordable health care to teachers, to loggers, and miners. That was back in 1965, 60 years ago. That's when the Blues developed the National Labor Office to strengthen its commitment to organized labor. Well, today, Blue Cross and Blue Shield's National Labor Office remains focused on America's workers, advocating for affordable and equitable health care. Partnering with strategic alliances to provide industry-leading products and services, and proudly serving more than 18 million unionized workers, retirees, and their families, all working hard for America's working families and for the health of America. You can learn more by following them at Blue Labor on LinkedIn and X, formerly known as Twitter. And remember, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast, AWF Union Podcast. You know, I've had many conversations, especially with John Russo, when John was a regular guest on behalf of the Center for Working Class Studies out of Youngstown State University. In fact, he did a deep dive into the history of Lordstown, a GM plant back in the early 70s, which is no more. I mean, there were 3 shifts going there. Joining us as our featured guest today as part of Labor 131, where we celebrate the 131st anniversary of the creation of Labor Day, is Jason Resnikoff. And Jason is an assistant professor of contemporary history. And we're going to talk about what happened at Lordstown. But first, Jason, I got to talk to you about you, because you're from New York and now you're in the northern part of the Netherlands. Talk to me about this shift. Why are you there? And why don't you explain the university that you're in right now? Because I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Go ahead, brother.
Oh, man, I've been living here for a few years now, and I still am not pronouncing it correctly. So I understand that feeling. I guess the short answer is I'm an academic from the United States. I got my PhD from Columbia, and then I go where the work takes me. And Harvard still hasn't called me back. But the University of Groningen in the northern part of the Netherlands called me back. And so it's a good job. I'm happy. You know, it's hard for academics to get like a tenure track position. They're few and far between, and it's a nice one here, and it's a nice place to land. And so I'm teaching labor history and American history here in the northern Netherlands, which is very interesting. It's a strange. I moved in 2022 to the Netherlands, and so Trump was reelected, or elected again, maybe is a better way to put it, while I was here. And of course, everything is from abroad. It looks, I don't know if it looks worse than it must be to experience, but it's very strange to be away when all of this is happening. And so on the one hand, maybe gives you some perspective on where you're from as you talk about this kind of history. On the other hand, it's a feeling of sort of wishing I was in the trenches with everybody else. But it's a nice place to be in the Netherlands. I recommend it. Uh-huh. It's quiet. It's, as they say about themselves, very chill, very calm place to be.
Yeah, a former partner of mine in radio worked in Amsterdam for a bit, and they were doing broadcast equipment over there. He was there for sales purposes, and he was always talking highly about Europe. I know Trump and Europe don't go together right now. I know there's, especially the trip to Ireland recently wasn't too pretty, but we're not going to get into that. We're going to talk about what happened many, many years ago, over 50 years ago in northeastern Ohio, the strike at Lordstown GM plant and Local 1112. A militant time in labor history, I guess we could put it that way. But talk to me about what you were able to uncover on this, because this is quite fascinating. And I was reading earlier about the fact that we hear so much about automation today, but this was kind of like the kickoff of automation in the auto industry. So let's start right there, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a scholar of automation in the United States of America, especially in this period. And the factory at Lordstown, they opened it in 1966. And by they, I mean General Motors. And as I'm saying this, I feel almost a little shy. I imagine many of your listeners know this story pretty well, and many of them might have lived through it or remember it quite well, although I was born afterwards. So I can't wait to hear what I don't know. But GM opened the factory in Lordstown, Ohio in 1966. And the purpose of the Lordstown assembly plant initially was to build the Vega, which was to be the little car that was going to compete with the small cars coming out of Germany and Japan. The U.S. auto industry was losing market share to these foreign automobile makers. And of course, the late 60s, early 70s, it's good to remember that this is The U.S. auto industry is feeling the pinch along with the rest of American manufacturing. There's a fall in the rate of profit these days. But one of the ideas behind specifically Lordstown was that it was going to be the most highly mechanized, in their words, the most highly automated plant in the world. And so, and it ended up being extremely fast, that assembly line. There's no doubt about that. I mean, when it opened, it was producing something like 60 cars an hour. And by the early 1970s, it was producing something like 102 cars an hour. They really got that thing going fast. And they claimed they were able to do so because they had a few new inventions that they were able to apply. Most notably was something called the Unimate. And this is actually, it would probably be familiar now to anyone who knows anything about the automobile industry. It's a robotic arm, but one of these things that looks sort of like a long neck, like a giraffe's neck or something that goes. And it could do a few things. It could do some spot welding, but mainly they used it originally to pick up pieces of metal that had been put in a die cast, something big and heavy. So it could put it in the metal, take out the metal after it had been punched into shape. The Unimate was first introduced, it's the first industrial robot, and it was first introduced into the automobile industry by GM in 1961 in New Jersey. But anyway, so the Lordstown factory was going to have a bunch of these Unimates. And they also had a few other computer systems that are actually just as important. One of them was a bunch of optical scanners along the assembly line that was going to find defective products and say, fix this, don't fix this, as well as to make sure that the line is keeping up to pace. And then finally, they had another computer system that was designed to allocate workers jobs. And the whole idea behind this was in order to make sure workers were working the full 60 minutes in an hour, that they didn't have any downtime when they were technically on the clock, and that the computer was going to assign them the right number of tasks. So beginning in the mid-1960s, GM is announcing we have the fastest assembly line in the world, but it's actually not working in the way they want it to. So they have to bring in a special division, the General Motors Assembly Division, or GMAD. And this was an organization within GM that went around to factories and essentially they cut workers and made things, quote unquote, more efficient. But what the UAW argued, and what the workers at 1112 would end up arguing, was that this was not efficiency, this was speed up. And that the mechanization, the Unimates, the computer systems, all of the optical scanners, that none of this was actually what was leading to the Lordstown line being the fastest in the world. What made it the fastest in the world was that these were the most put upon workers in the GM universe. And I think history has borne them out. That is correct. They were working really hard. And GMAD did this at Lordstown, but GMAD did this at many different factories across the United States. And the result was in 1972, a big strike, a rebellion, because workers said it was one of the worst places to work, even though technically, and this is the thing I wanted to maybe talk about, we have time, the pay was good. They were protected by a union. And this is what today you might call a good job. But at the time, people said it was like prison. It was carceral. There were many things they didn't like about it. I guess we can get into that.
Well, let's do that right now because, and also we should point out the average age at the plant. I mean, because it's been described as a youth rebellion.
Yeah.
What kind of demographic are we looking at?
Yeah, at Lordstown, they were young. They were in their mid-20s for the most part. And as well, the Lordstown factory was sort of a flagship factory because it opened as an integrated factory. It was black and white workers working together. And it was seen sort of as a paragon of racial harmony in the industrial firmament. Right? The other problems that other industries had would not happen at Lordstown. And so when the workers do rebel in the early 1970s, 1972 actually, the reasons they give are not specifically bad pay or anything like that, which one would consider a more traditional reason for going on strike, but rather the basic argument was that the working conditions were inhuman. And they listed a few things specifically. They said that, well, they said this is true, that they were given a lot of disciplinary layoffs because, look, GMAD comes in, they're driving the workers harder, and the workers start saying, we don't want to work under these sort of sped up rates. We don't want to work under these sort of taskmasters. People were being yelled at all the time. Things were dangerous. People were getting hurt. And they wanted to have more control over the job. And so the ways they would do this is they could go to their union office and say, this guy gave me an order I don't want to do. And people were getting disciplinary layoffs for, insubordination, these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these guys, most of them were men, but not only men, but many of them were veterans of the Vietnam War. And they had brought home a criticism of Vietnam. They were saying we're encountering the same kind of really intense hierarchy that we experienced in Vietnam, but now we're having it here in America at our jobs that are supposed to be good jobs. And so this mix of like really steep hierarchy, really harsh discipline, and at the same time, really fast and even dangerous working conditions, led these young workers to say, we don't want to do this. And of course, because they're young, because they're in their 20s, the media in particular is like, these are spoiled kids, these long hair hippie types, right? They just don't want to work like their dads work. Their dads knew how to be disciplined, but these guys, they live off the fat of the land, and because they're spoiled, basically because they're the boomers, right?
Right.
Everyone has been calling the boomers spoiled since day one, right? Even today now, they're coming in for new abuse. But actually, I would push back against that story because just down the road at the Norwood factory, also in Ohio, the GMAD group, the division, took over the Norwood factory too. They weren't producing the Vega, they were producing Novas and Camaros. And there, the workers were substantially older. Like most of them were in their mid to late 30s was the average age, while Lordstown was 25. And there, they went on strike too at the same time. But their strike was actually much longer. It was 122 days, while Lordstown was only 22. So I think the media wanted to say that this is just rebellious youth, but there was something else going on at the time in the 1970s. That workers across industries and across generations were actually pushing back.
Jason, if you don't mind, let's take a pause here because this is quite fascinating. I love this discussion. Our featured guest today on behalf of Labor 131 is Jason Resnikoff at the University of Groningen. Is that the best way to pronounce it?
You got it.
Okay, very good. Assistant Professor of Contemporary History in the Upper Netherlands. We'll continue with Jason right after this. Once again, you're listening to America's Workforce. Don't go away. And remember, you can check us out on at least 5 platforms. That includes YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. And when you get an opportunity, here's what you do. Just sign up and receive our shows on a regular basis and give us a rating. We always appreciate those 5-star ratings, so please keep them coming. I love doing this show. And I'll tell you, we have guests not just in America, but around the entire world. And our featured guest today on behalf of Labor 131, the 131st anniversary of Labor Day, is Jason Resnikoff. He's at the University of Groningen, which is in the Upper Netherlands. And we're talking about the Lordstown strike going back to 1972 and the role of Local 1112. Let's talk about the role of the union. I mean, think about the auto workers. I mean, they are a shell in the auto industry of what they were back then. I mean, they've gone on to organize graduate student workers and things like that because they had to. Because so many of those good jobs, and these were good jobs back in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, they're not here anymore. What was the role of 1112? I mean, these young folks, you mentioned they're in their 20s, many of them Vietnam vets. They were mad as hell. They didn't want to take it anymore. The conditions, they were getting paid well, but the conditions were atrocious. It kind of reminds me of what Amazon's workers are going through today. I mean, some of them are paid okay, but the conditions are not good at all. What was the role of Local 1112 in all this, Jason?
It's a good question because, again, this is a particularly young local and a militant one and a feisty one. And I think what the local did was it pushed the union to go on strike for things that not necessarily in the past it would have done, right? We think about what the UAW went on strike for. Even in 1970, there was a big GM strike across the nation. Usually these were standard of living aspects to the contract, right? They want better unemployment, for example, or more protections, health insurance, this kind of thing. But here, and also if you look at the Treaty of Detroit in 1950, this famous agreement that Reuther makes with the big 3 auto companies at the time, one of the big giveaways that the union gave, and I say giveaway, that makes it sound like it was easy for Reuther and co. to do it. I don't mean it that way. But one of the big concessions that they made was that workers would not have any demand over quote unquote production standards. That is, they wouldn't have any say in contracts over how the cars were actually made, what the work process was. And in return, they would get all of these benefits that maybe in a welfare state that was more robust would have been, a privilege of citizenship rather than a membership in the union, like healthcare, like time off, this kind of thing, like some kind of job protection in general. And so that was the kind of thing that the union was more comfortable negotiating over. But these young guys, they said, well, the union can also negotiate over this thing that we conceded in 1950, which is how are we actually going to do this job? And not just questions of health and safety, which of course had always been a part of negotiations for contracts since the 1950s, but rather what would make this a good job or a better job? And not just like, don't speed us up, but what would make this even a fulfilling or rewarding job? Because you mentioned something just a moment ago, which is that these were good jobs. And certainly by the standards of what would come after, they were secure, they were well paid. It allowed people who had been members of the lower part of the working class to become middle class, upper working class, however you want to think about that. You could get a cabin in the woods, real stuff that's not, especially today, is not at all inconsequential. But one of the reasons I find it so interesting is that these were workers who were enjoying quote unquote good jobs, and they did not think they were good jobs. And it's sort of something that I think is useful for us when we look at maybe what the MAGA movement promises today, or Trump and his tariffs. We could just reshore all of this industry. We can go back to the great time of the 1950s when everyone was happy in their industrial job. But the people who actually had those industrial jobs in the 1950s, the 60s, and the 70s said these are not in and of themselves good jobs because we don't feel free at work. It's only when you compare it to devastating unemployment that you could call this a good job. So that's one of the things that's so inspiring about the labor movement in the 1970s. You have this grassroots movement among not just the UAW, but across the labor firmament. And people saying we can make things better if we got more democracy at work. That's really what they were asking for. So they wanted democracy in the unions as well. The UAW wasn't as bad as some by any means, right? The UAW was more democratic than the Teamsters or the mine workers union. They had to have serious insurgencies among steelworkers and the miners and the Teamsters in particular. But even when you look at the UAW, you had these grassroots movements like League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and also the guys in 1112 who said, we want to actually fight for democracy at work, something that had not been on the table for most of the post-war period. I think it's one of the reasons it's an inspiring strike.
You mentioned in the first segment about white and black workers at Lordstown. And keep in mind, we're talking late 60s and then leading up to the strike in 72. How did they get along back then at Lordstown?
Well, I mean, from what I understand, generally, one of the things that was inspiring about 1112 is that this was a workforce that was able to work together extremely well across race lines. I mean, and this was at a time when the movement and movement politics was shattering across the board, right?
Right.
It's one of the things that's sort of depressing about the 1960s, right? But by the time you get into the late 1960s, what had been called the movement breaks into all kinds of movements. It's depressing, but not, right? It's depressing in the sense that you lose some solidarity, right? You have, right, the black activists in Colombia saying all the white activists need to leave during the occupation, right? They're not going to work together. They want to keep these things separate. The reasons they did that are understandable, but at the same time, you have sort of a loss of momentum. The benefit, of course, is that you get more specific movements, the gay liberation movement, the women's movement, Black Power movement. You have some advantages there because people are able to more focus in on different kinds of liberation. But again, one of the reasons that Lordstown was so inspiring to people, especially on the left in 1972, was that it seemed that those divisions had been surmounted by the workers themselves because they were able to agree. They had to agree on something. They had this common experience, which is that all of them together were being put upon by their bosses. And actually, that's something that the labor movement continues to offer. We talk about movement politics. We all have different ethnicities, different identities. All of that stuff needs to be recognized. But one of the things we have in common, all of us, is that if you're a working person, your boss is your boss, and usually they're not very nice. And so this is something that links people together.
Yeah.
And I think 1112 was inspiring that way. When other parts of the movement were shattering, these guys were coming together. It was cool.
What about General Motors? I mean, this was a well-publicized strike. And then you also mentioned the one at Norwood, which went much longer than the one at Lordstown, both of the strikes in Ohio. Did GM learn anything from what happened there? I mean, sometimes I know that's a tall order for a company that has a history going back to the 30s with labor strikes and all that. But I'm just wondering, did it have an effect on the management? Did they change anything?
Well, I mean, the result of the strike was that, it wasn't a clear victory or defeat for either side. They sort of went back to like the status quo ante. So GMAT loosened its grip a little bit on the workers. They slowed things down. But the basic thrust of GM, no, I would argue that they did not learn anything. And in fact, what really saved the automotive industry in general, but GM in particular, was that while the early 70s might have been radical, by the time you get the oil shocks, the economic recession, the downturn, a lot of this utopianism, this call for democracy on the part of workers was, hard to maintain when people are just worried about putting food on the table,
Yeah.
right? When the industry itself seems to be shaking. And so what GM was actually doing in the early 1970s, it was sort of in the forefront of this. So the guy in charge of GM, a guy named Gerstenberg, they brought him in because he was good at financializing things. Right? He was the finance guy. And he was going to find ways to pinch pennies and efficient ways. And of course, they did the same things they'd always done for the most part, which is that they moved factories to places where labor wasn't organized, and they pushed the workers that were there all harder. But nevertheless, he had this reputation for someone who knew how to count dollars and cents and that certainly did not change for GM. And I don't think the reason is because they were necessarily incapable of learning. The thing that would teach them would be continued worker militancy, and that was something that the workers themselves can maintain, not when they're so worried about simply holding on to a job. I mean, and also you want to talk about GM learning things. I mean, it's a few years ago now, but GM got caught up in this huge scandal about their ignitions that would just turn off. And I mean, if anything, their management's only gotten even worse and less responsible, I would argue.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're not alone in that. Let's be honest about that. The sad part about this whole situation, I followed what happened there my entire broadcast career, and it's all hollowed out now, that Mahoning Valley area.
Yeah.
And it changed politically as well because, you lose your job. You don't forget that day. You don't forget that day. And here's Lordstown. I remember when they were doing they did the Cobalt there. They had the Chevy Cruze. And that was the last one. They phased it out. They had 3 shifts working there, and now nothing. Foxconn came in there, promised all kind of stuff. Trump came over there, told everybody, don't sell your houses. Jobs are going to come back. And I just saw a story. This was just a couple of days ago that there's another company trying to resurrect some business there. But let's be honest, it's not going to go back. I know you mentioned the MAGA movement and how they want to take everything back to the 1950s. Those days are gone, aren't they?
I mean, it's a good question. It's like, the thing that Trump is so all over the place, and who knows what he actually wants with his tariff policy. And even if he could reshore industry solely through tariffs, would the industry that came back be unionized? Would it be good jobs in that sense? I highly doubt it. That doesn't seem like what this guy at all wants. But nevertheless, it's something that is, it's kind of not a false promise, but something that many people in the labor movement do want. And he's speaking to an actual desire, even if it won't really happen. I'm thinking of 2 things. So I was an organizer for the UAW in academic organizing at Columbia. And I remember in 2016, a member of the International came back from some meeting he had in the Midwest. And he said, it looks like in 2016, a third of the membership is Trump curious at the very least. I mean, it's hard to imagine now anyone watching what this administration is doing to the NLRB and doing with its own labor policy, anyone a member of the labor movement really taking Trump seriously as someone who would defend them. But even as late as 2024, you had, at the Republican National Convention, you had Sean O'Brien of the Teamsters addressing the Republican convention. The actual speech, he could have given most of that maybe at a Democratic National Convention. But nevertheless, this idea that maybe the Republicans will do it for them, with this nationalist aggressive tariff policy, we can go back to the good old days when there was a factory at Lordstown. And I think there are 2 things to that. One, I don't think so. I don't think we're going to Trump or the Republicans are going to do that. And even if they were to do something like that, I think what's useful about Lordstown, and I hope I'm not repeating myself, is that wasn't so. It was good to have a job. It's important to have a job. There's no question about that. But the people that had those jobs said there's much more to have. There's more that you want on the job than simply the mere ability to subsist. And that's the ability to be free at work, so some democracy at work.
Yeah.
And I think if people like Sean O'Brien are going to be Trump curious and playing with these things, they should keep that in mind too. What it means to actually have a good job and what you want in the future, not simply to go back in time, but to build something better going forward. And that's one of the lessons I take from Lordstown today.
Jason, this has been a wonderful conversation. I really enjoy having you on the show today as part of Labor 131. You're the kind of guy I'd like to have a few pops with sometime. We'll have maybe on my bucket list, I'm going to have to look you up. I've never been to Europe. Never been to Europe.
Get out of town.
And I retired from my public service job this year. And it's on my bucket list. So I'm going to look you up down the road because you and I could have some fun conversations, okay?
You're always welcome.
Jason Resnikoff, our featured guest on behalf of Labor 131, Assistant Professor of Contemporary History at the University of Groningen, which is in the Upper Netherlands, talking about what happened in northeastern Ohio more than 50 years ago. We'll leave it at that note. And that'll be it for another edition of America's Workforce. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to check in with National Nurses United. That and more. Until then, all of you have a safe and wonderful day.